Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation, and thanks to you and to Armando Bramanti for inviting me. Today I intend to present the educational training through which a would-be scribe became a bureaucrat in second millennium Babylonia, nowadays southern Iraq. In recent years, there has been renewed interest in Sumerian scribal education, with a focus on the Old Babylonian period because of its extraordinary richness in school documentation. During this period, Sumerian, which is an isolate, that is, it is not related to any other language or language family, was no longer spoken. By the end of the 3rd millennium BC, it had probably died out, progressively supplanted by Akkadian, which belonged to the family of Semitic languages such as Hebrew or Arabic. However, Sumerian was still used in a wide variety of literary, scholarly, and religious genres. It had a function quite similar to Latin in medieval and modern European civilization. Furthermore, during the first 2.5 centuries of the 2nd millennium, the so-called Isin Larsa period, Sumerian was used in the daily administration in southern Babylonian cities. Therefore, in order to learn cuneiform script, which represents the more distinctive feature of the Mesopotamian tradition, Akkadian-speaking students were trained to read and write the Sumerian language. We can therefore argue that the Sumerian elementary education in the Old Babylonian schools should be considered the first ever curriculum devised to teach a foreign and dead language. This is especially true for the city of Nippur in southern Babylonia, home to a prestigious scribal tradition in the Old Babylonian period. It seems that there existed an elitism among the Nippur scribes, whose training entailed the absolute mastery of the Sumerian language. This elitism is emphasized by the almost complete absence of written Akkadian at Nippur. This lack of Akkadian does not indicate that the scribes were unskilled in the language, but that they probably would know Akkadian prior to beginning their scribal training. This was not the case for the rest of Babylonia, in particular for the northern site of Kish, where the scribal students were instructed to copy a high percentage of Akkadian texts in their early and advanced education to prepare them for the local daily requirements of scribal life. The Sumerian term for school is eduba, which literally means house in which tablets are distributed. The first attestations of this term are found in royal hymns of the late 2nd millennium BC, although schools must have already existed much earlier. Its simplified translation as tablet house corresponds to the Akkadian expression bit tupi. The term eduba stands for school, library, and scriptorium at the same time. As Eleanor Robson argued, the eduba can be considered the tablet house in another sense too. The archaeological investigations carried out in some scribal schools in Nippur have shown that school tablets were built into the very floors, walls, and furniture of the rooms. Our most reliable knowledge of the Mesopotamian scribal school comes from archaeological discoveries in the cities of Nippur, Ur, Siparamnanum, Uruk, and Kish, as well as the large number of surviving school texts. Evidence from all of these sites demonstrate that school activities occurred in private buildings during the Old Babylonian period. Teachers used spaces in their own homes as classrooms. As such, schools could accommodate no more than 3 to 5 students at any given time. Sometimes, several such private buildings were next to one another in a scribal quarter. Lessons probably took place in the main courtyard. The need to stay outdoors derives from the fundamental importance of direct sunlight for reading and writing the cuneiform script inscribed on clay tablets. An emblematic example of Old Babylonian scribal school is House F, excavated during the archaeological campaign conducted jointly by the University of Philadelphia and Chicago in 1951-1952. It was a small domestic building, about 45 square meters, in the middle of urban Nippur, consisting of a small courtyard, locus 192, 3 small rooms, 184, 189, and 191, and a larger room or courtyard, 205. House F yielded nearly 1,500 fragments of tablets, almost all recording Sumerian literature or school exercises. Furthermore, 3 baked brick boxes were found scattered around the building, one of which contained a large storage jar filled with small pots. Another was instead filled with tablet fragments and clay. Therefore, these have been interpreted as recycling bins, into which all the tablets could be thrown for soaking, reshaping, and reuse. We have no written information about the age of the pupils who attended the school. However, circumstantial evidence, such as bite or finger marks on tablets, suggests that students started very early, perhaps around 5 years of age. Taking into account the large quantity of material to be mastered, it can be assumed that the scribal education must have continued for several years, and the specialist training may have extended into adulthood. The study of the thousands of school tablets brought to light by archaeological excavations has been used as a primary source for the reconstruction of the Sumerian scribal curriculum in the Old Babylonian period. This reconstruction was essentially based on school records from Nippur, which was home to a prestigious scribal tradition in the Old Babylonian period and was considered Babylonia's cultural capital. School tablets can be assigned to one of 5 tablet types within the classification system proposed by Miguel Civil in the 60s and further nuanced by Steve Tinney. Type 1 are large multi-column tablets, usually with 2 to 6 columns per side, containing either an entire literary composition or lexical text, or a collection of model contracts or proverbs. These tablets seem to have been written by advanced students rather than being standard reference copies prepared by teachers. This is sometimes confirmed by the presence of a colophon with the name of the apprentice scribe, Dubsartur in Sumerian. Colophons contained paratextual information such as the scribe's name, his patronymic, the number of lines or sections, and sometimes a date. They appear on the reverse of the tablet at the bottom, separated from the main text by a blank space or a single or double line. Colophons sometimes also contain a doxology, usually consisting of an invocation to Nisaba, the goddess of grain, writing, and wisdom, worshipped in Uruk, Umma, and other southern Mesopotamian cities. Typically, it reads, Nisaba Zami, Nisaba be praised. Type 1 tablets also included the so-called micro tablets. Despite their very small size, about 5 to 6 centimeters per side, these have all the formal characteristic of multi-column tablets. The cuneiform signs engraved on these objects, despite being microscopic and impossible to read without the aid of magnifying glasses, are perfectly made. In this photo, you can see how little space the tablet takes up in my hand. It is not clear how the ancient scribes were able to write microtablets. Some believe they used magnifying glasses. Others, instead, argue that their dimensions are the result of a peculiar drying process. The shrinkage of clay from drying is regularly observed in the manufacture of ceramic objects and cuneiform tablets, but the reduction in length usually ranges from 1/10 to 1/5 of the original length. To create microtablets, the longitudinal shrinkage would have to have been about 50%, which is equivalent to a reduction to 1/8 of the original volume. Type 2 tablets, or teacher-student tablets, are of medium size and have different exercises written on the obverse and reverse. On the obverse, the left-hand column contains the model text written by a more experienced hand, intended to be copied into prepared blank columns on the right hand by the student. There are few examples of tablets in which the pupil's copy has been preserved. The normal procedure provided that the columns were regularly deleted in order to copy the exercise several times. As a result, the right-hand half of the obverse is usually unwritten and much thinner than the left hand, as in this tablet, if not entirely broken. Furthermore, very often tablets were purposely broken in two, as in this second tablet, in order to preserve the teacher's model for future use. The reverse is divided into 3 to 5 columns and contains a longer section of a composition that the student had previously learned and was practicing once again. This is an example of a type 2 tablet in which it is possible to see the teacher's version in the left-hand column of the obverse. In the right hand, instead, the copy by the student is only partially preserved. On the reverse, there is a composition previously studied by the same student, divided into several columns. Type 3 tablets are single-column tablets, in Sumerian ingidda, long tablet, containing a short section, 10 to 50 lines, of a longer composition, and sometimes the first line of the next section not copied. The poor quality of the script indicates that they are written by students, perhaps copied from the teacher's example written on the left column of a type 2 tablet. Type 3 tablets are thought to represent a single day's lesson. Here is an example of a type 3 tablet with 2 different texts, 2 model contracts, separated by a single ruling. Type 4 tablets are lenticular-shaped tablets, the most easily identifiable among the school records. They are the most common type of exercises in collection acquired on the market, since they are frequently found complete or nearly complete, well-shaped, and with a clear writing. Lentil-shaped tablets contain a few lines of a composition, usually some entries of a lexical list, a short mathematical problem, or a proverb. The obverse usually has the model text, and the reverse has the student's copy. Sometimes the student copied the text on the obverse below the teacher's model, and used the reverse for annotations in Akkadian, that is his mother tongue, or to do calculations. It is not clear what functional differences existed between type 4 and type 2 tablets, since both were used as practice tablets in the early stages of learning. Some have speculated that lentils were the tablets that were brought home to demonstrate progress at school to parents. And finally, Prism was a 3-dimensional object with 4 to 8 faces containing 1 to 4 columns per face, with the same content as type 1 tablets. All Old Babylonian prisms display a hole pierced from bottom to top, apparently to facilitate the handling of the object once mounted on a stick. Probably this expedient was also used to avoid the damage of such a large surface by the natural expansion and contraction of clay due to the cooking and the drying process. The quality of the text inscribed on them can be substantially inferior to those of other exercise tablets, indicating that prisms either had a different function or were copied by less advanced pupils. Some have speculated that they were made for special occasions, such as school exams. This would also explain their relative rarity. It is important to emphasize that tablet typology may have been used for different pedagogical purposes in different cities. Our reconstruction of the order of the Sumerian elementary curriculum at Nippur is based on the sequence of text on type 2 tablets, in which the obverse presented a brand new exercise and the reverse contained one previously learned. By gathering the type 2 tablets and comparing the data on the obverse and reverse, Nick Feldhaus was able to reconstruct the sequence in which the elementary exercises were learned in the Nippur curriculum. Outside the Nippur, where the great majority of school tablets belong to type 2, teacher-student tablets are less frequent. As Feldhaus argued, there may be several reasons why non-Nippur examples are so rare. This type of exercise is meant for recycling. As said before, archaeological excavations have shown that all tablets were usually thrown in a clay basin in order to be reused. Furthermore, type 2 tablets are unattractive. They are usually broken or mutilated, full of erasures and deformed signs. Thus, those that escaped recycling in antiquity may have been regarded as unfit for commercial purposes in modern times, and thus discarded at illicit excavations. Those deriving from regular excavations may belong to an unattractive portion of tablets still unpublished today. Also, a certain degree of curricular variation does occur, but regionally and between different schools within the same city, it is possible to argue a general similarity in the structure of scribal education throughout Babylonia. In other words, the contents of the scribal curriculum could generally stay intact without following a rigid sequence. This was not due to any enforcement by some central authority, but rather to a shared sense of what proper scribal education was, what its goals were, and how these goals might be reached. Therefore, it is reasonable to consider that the purpose of the Sumerian curriculum was to establish an exclusive scribal class whose identity was based on sharing specialized knowledge. Sumerian education consisted of teaching a tradition that highlighted the unity of the southern Babylonian cities. This also helps to explain why the curriculum was similar geographically, diachronically, and synchronically, even if Sumerian scribal training was in private hands. Old Babylonian scribal school, therefore, acted as a uniform and coherent institution, representing a model of social behavior that followed conventional rules and was endowed with scientific, moral, and political authority. Starting from the hypothesis that there were different levels of learning, which not all scribes necessarily would have had to face, two clearly distinct educational stages have been identified within the Old Babylonian scribal curriculum. An elementary phase in which students learn the basics of the cuneiform script, as well as Sumerian lexicon, grammar, and syntax. In this first stage, it was the teacher, Ummiya in Sumerian, who guided the students in learning. They simply had to copy the model text they wrote or write the exercise under dictation. And an advanced phase in which students copied a wide array of Sumerian literary compositions. The second phase of scribal education does not use teacher-students tablets. Students memorized and copied out literary compositions, memorizing each text section by section. Then they would produce the entire literary composition from memory on a multi-column tablet before progressing to the next text in the curricular sequence. We know that not all scribes continued in the advanced curriculum. Those who intended to specialize in an administrative field, legal affairs, temple or palace administration, and so on, thus joining the ranks of bureaucracy, did not need to deepen the knowledge of literary text. In elementary education, or phase 1, students began by learning to inscribe cuneiform signs, starting with individual wedges and moving on to more complicated combinations. Afterwards, they learned the syllabic values of the shapes they had just mastered and progressed from there to learn long lists of Sumerian vocabulary by rote, as well as more complex cuneiform signs. Elementary education included lessons in metrology and grammar and ended with the pupils' first exposure to Sumerian sentences in the form of model contracts and to poetic language in the form of proverbs. This first educational phase, therefore, shows a steady progression of exercises that move from simple to complex. The order of the elementary Sumerian scribal curriculum, as well as the pedagogical function of each stage, are relatively well established, at least in Nippur, even if sometimes teachers may not have adhered to a standard curriculum. In general, education at Old Babylonian scribal schools followed more or less set patterns, but within those boundaries, there was plenty of space for experimentation and variation. The second stage of the Sumerian scribal curriculum included hymns to gods and kings, narratives about gods and heroes, literary letters and dialogues and debates. Unlike the elementary phase, the advanced one was not highly standardized, neither at Nippur nor elsewhere. Although certain compositions enjoyed widespread popularity, individual teachers made their own choices as to the compositions that would be studied and the order of their study. Leaving aside the advanced stage, let us now focus on the last part of the elementary phase. It represents a real practical training, as it provides apprentice scribes with a professional qualification oriented towards a specific sector of society. Some activities required not only the ability to write, but also the acquisition of a specific set of technical skills. This is the case, for instance, of the scribes who worked for the administration of the palace or temple, who had to master the necessary vocabulary and the legal administrative procedures, and who were often required to assume responsibilities within bureaucratic institutions. To deepen this aspect of scribal education, the study of the so-called model contracts is of fundamental importance. They were taught at the end of the long first phase, in which students learned how to manage the founding aspects of writing and language. Model contracts combined a number of different elements that were acquired beforehand: personal names, metrology, commodities, and legal expressions. Although they were simply didactic tools rather than functional documents, and therefore lacked in incidental details, such as the list of witnesses and the date, model contracts still present the general structure of actual Sumerian contracts. The compiling of such exercises trained the would-be scribe in the task of composing any possible contract required for the everyday economic life. Most instructive is an Old Babylonian school composition known as edubadi or scribal activities that describes the skills a scribe had to acquire during his education, including the ability to write any type of contract. This list includes marriage contracts, creation of commercial partnerships, deeds of sale of movable and immovable property, field and orchard leases, and adoptions. To this must be added barley and silver loans, manumission of slaves, and divisions of inheritance. This set of skills was not only necessary for the state administration and its bureaucratic institution, but also useful in the management of private affairs. The number of tablets containing model contracts known to date amounts to over 350. This number is certainly destined to increase. In fact, the academic nature of these tablets has not always been recognized in the past. It is often very difficult at first sight to identify their features and to distinguish school contracts from actual administrative or legal documents, especially if they are fragmentary, as they unfortunately are most of the time. Furthermore, it should be noted that the total number of contracts is much higher than 350. Indeed, there are even large tablets and four-sided prisms, which can also contain up to 50 different contracts. At present, only a portion, about a fifth of the total of the model contracts, has been published in scholarly volumes and articles, while more than half of the entire corpus is accessible online at the database Old Babylonian Model Contracts, a digital project of which I am the principal investigator. This website is hosted within the ORAC initiative and provides an annotated, searchable edition of the Sumerian model contracts. Based on a total of 185 tablets and prisms that have been transliterated on OBMC, I counted at least 500 contracts. It has almost 3 times the number of tablets. However, this figure can only be considered a very rough estimate due to the fragmentary state of a relevant part of the documentation. As you can see from this chart, most of the model contracts known to date come from Nippur. This is not surprising since, as said before, the basis for our reconstruction of Sumerian scribal education comes primarily from this city. The label Other comprises tablets from various cities. In order of number of attestation, these are Sippar, Ur, Larsa, Isin, and Tulu-Khattab, whose ancient name is not clearly known. Finally, the label Unknown collects all the tablets which have no archaeological context. Therefore, the hypotheses about their origin are based exclusively on internal criteria. This chart shows the proportion of the different types of contracts according to their occurrence in the sample under study. The most attested are the loan contracts, with the prevalence of barley loans, followed by silver loans, and to a much lesser extent, sesame and brick loans. Then there are deeds of sales, with the prevalence of houses, followed by fields, orchards, and finally slaves, manumission of slaves, rental or leases, comprising houses, fields, boats, and orchards, adoptions, and the so-called model court cases, known also as literal legal decision. Model court cases are sample court settlements lacking witnesses and date, and sometimes extant in multiple copies, used to train the scribes in the forms of the functional court records. Model court cases are attested in far fewer numbers than model contracts. The limited corpus includes some common cases, such as inheritance disputes, cases about barley loans or concerning burgled houses, but also some more sensational cases, a homicide case, the famous Nippur homicide trial, 2 adultery cases, and a case regarding the rape of a female slave. Several of these fictional records are peppered with colorful features. Model court cases are also especially tied to the city of Nippur, not only because the most of the provenance copies were found in that city, but also because many refer directly to the Nippur assembly. Furthermore, some of them mention one of the kings of the Isin dynasty to whom petitioners appealed, Ishme-Dagan, Ur-Ninurta, Bursin, and El-Ilbani. The in-depth study of model contracts serves a dual purpose. Thanks to the information provided by this corpus of text, it is possible to investigate how, in ancient Mesopotamia, technical and legal knowledge was transmitted through the generations, thus contributing to deepen and complete our knowledge of scribal education. The potential of the economic and administrative data belonging to this well-defined body of documentation can be used as an interpretive key for investigating the socioeconomic dynamics of second millennium Babylonia. It is now evident that as model contracts were specifically chosen by schools to be taught to the future member of the bureaucracy, they acquire a paradigmatic value to the eyes of the modern reader and become a reliable and comprehensive representation of the administrative, social, and economic reality from which they stem. In a nutshell, they represent an innovative point of view from which to look at and analyze Babylonian society in order to understand major issues in the economic and social spheres, like lending and the trading practices, and the rules governing the family law. In comparing model contracts with real administrative and legal contracts, one notes the absence of a list of witnesses and of a date, but essential for the legal validity of a document. In their place, some model contracts include the notation Luki Nimma itibimubi, its witnesses, its month, its year, while others simply omit this information altogether. However, in at least one occurrence, model contracts present both witnesses and date. It is a prism kept in the Skoyen collection, Oslo, in which, quite surprisingly, all 17 contracts end with a list of 1 to 3 witnesses. The last one is always the scribe, and the date. However, it should be noted that some year names seem not to be attested elsewhere. Nevertheless, being only a single occurrence, we can continue to consider the lack of these elements as an important indicator of the school nature of a text. Often, model contracts were arranged in compilation tablets in a concise order, obviously for didactic purposes. These collections occasionally consisted of groups where related model contracts differed from each other in the values for one or more of the contractual variables. For example, a group of barley loan contracts might focus on the ascending progression in the quantities of barley lent out, as in the following prism. In the case of a series of real estate contracts, instead, the main distinctive element might be the description of the house, size, location, boundary, and so on, the price paid, and the names of the persons involved. The repetitive character of this text was useful for explaining and drilling Sumerian sentences and formulas. Also, just like other school compositions such as proverbs and literary letters, even model contracts were studied in standardized series of similar contracts. Other features that can be found in model contracts are the lack of any ceiling, which is normally present in everyday contracts recording transactions of goods or people. The presence of a large portion of the tablet left uninscribed, sometimes the entire reverse. This is a feature in common with other school texts and stands in contrast to functional documents in which both sides of the tablet are inscribed. The existence of multiple copies of the same contract, and finally, the use of school names should also be noted, that is, personal names that occur several times in different contracts. Then, there are other peculiarities that model contracts have in common with the school documents in general. The presence of a colophon and a doxology to the goddess Nisaba. At Nippur, colophons are typical of type 1 tablets and prisms, but sometimes they also occur in single column tablets. Doxologies typically read Nisaba be praised. And the presence of a catch line, the last line of the tablet on the tablet, but the first line of the next contract not copied in a collection of model contracts. It may occur in type 2 and type 3 tablets. In this single column tablet, recording the manumission of a female slave, the last line on the reverse reads one sang munus, a woman, which is the first line of the next contract in the series of manumissions of slaves. The learning of model contracts occurred through the memorization of some standardized collections. We have some examples of collections of model contracts, the order of which is based on the more or less stable order of contracts on compilation tablets, type 1 tablets and prisms, and on catch lines in type 2 and type 3 tablets. One of the most frequent series of contracts among the documentation under study is a collection of 9 contracts recording the manumission of female and male slaves. Manumission was one of the 3 ways through which slavery could be ended, and often took the form of a ceremony during which some symbolic acts occurred, such as the purification of the slave's forehead and the breaking of the pot of slavery. In manumission contracts originating from Sippar, different symbolic acts can appear, such as the smashing of the foot fetters, the releasing of the slave's ring, or the losing of the abuttu, a distinctive mark placed on the slave, the exact nature of which is disputed. It may have been a distinctive hairstyle or a brand or mark. The basic pattern of the Old Babylonian Nippur manumission contracts may contain the following elements: freedom establishing clause, ritual action clauses, document drafting clause, service until master's death, no contest clause, and oaths. This tablet records the manumission of a female slave named Ishtar Ennam. After the declaration of manumission of Ishtar Ennam by her master Lugalamaru through the symbolic acts presented above, the inheritance share granted to the freed slave is listed. It includes both movable and immovable property. Then, the declaration of service until master deaths appear. This means that the slave, though legally free, still remained in a state of dependency and became completely free only after the death of her former master. The contract ends with the no contest clause that protected the freed slave against any future claims by the former owner's heir. Among the corpus of model contracts, identify the collection of 9 contracts recording manumission of slaves. The first 5 contracts record the manumission of female slaves, whereas the remaining 4 record the manumission of male slaves. The entire sequence of 9 manumission contracts appears only in a 4-sided prism kept in the Hilprecht collection of Vienna, Germany. 1 to 4 contracts of the series also occur on tablets of types 1, 2, and 3. The order of the contracts is confirmed in all the documentation available to us. Some evidence that emerged from the analysis of this series seems to confirm what has already been demonstrated about the learning of mathematical and literary texts. Type 2 and 3 tablets were used in the first stages of learning so that students could practice the entire series of contracts step by step. After completing this process, once each contract had been memorized, pupils would then review the entire series by copying it by heart on compilation tablets, type 1 tablets and prisms, starting with the beginning of the series, but rarely reaching the end. This explains why the most attested contract in the documentation studied is the one that begins the series. To conclude, I would like to present a model contract in which we can identify some formulas and expressions peculiar to school documentation. It is written on a type 3 tablet and concerns the rescue and adoption of an abandoned baby by a Nugig priestess. The tablet also contains a second model contract about the sale of an orchard planted with date palms. The contract begins with a clause declaring the adoption of the abandoned baby, followed by a clause establishing the penalty for breaking the contract by the adopter, and ends with an oath in the names of the gods Nanna and Shamash and of the king Rimsin, the 10th king of the Larsa dynasty. The combination of the 2 deities and the name of the ruler of Larsa in the oath formula lead us to hypothesize an origin of this tablet from the city of Larsa, or one of the cities under its direct control. Among various societies throughout history, there was the practice of exposing unwanted infants. Parents who did not want or could not care for their child exposed it, thereby renouncing all rights and obligations to the baby, who was now in an outside, ownerless and lawless area where the dogs roam, which is outside the legal borders of the community. A precise and evocative phraseology is used here to describe the status of an abandoned child. He was found at a well, Putapadda. It is interesting to note that Putapadda was a common Sumerian personal name. Was rescued from the street, Silatakurra, literally brought home from the street, snatched from the mouth of a dog, Ka Urgirrata Badakar, dropped from the mouth of a raven, Kaugata Badanshub. These same expressions appear in the first millennium lexical list Anetishu and Dura, whereas a less picturesque expression was usually employed in real-life contracts to describe an abandoned child, without father or mother, Adanutuku, Amanutuku. In this case, the identity of the adopter of the rescued baby is not worthy. It is in fact a Nugig, Akkadian Kadishtu, to be translated as holy woman. Nugig were devotees of the god Adad, as her name itself shows, Simat Adad, fitting for Adad, and unlike other priestesses, they were not cloistered, could own property, marry, and bear children. In addition, they served as wet nurses or midwives. Their duties were not limited to nursing infants, but extended all through the pregnancy, administering the physical preparations and caregiving to the pregnant. A parent who tried unlawfully to dissolve the legal tie between himself and his child by using the formula, "You are not my son," could expect to be severely punished. The most common penalty for an adopter who denies the legal bond with the adoptee was the forfeiture of movable and immovable property, as in the present case. She shall forfeit house, field, orchard, female and male slaves, possessions and utensils as much as there may be. Usually, but not in this case, penalties were foreseen also for the adoptee who had uttered the formula, "You are not my father," or "You are not my mother." The most common penalty was the sale into slavery. Now, I conclude. During the Old Babylonian period, the study of Sumerian by non-native Akkadian speakers was central in the scribal schools of the major cities of Babylonia. This is especially true for the city of Nippur, home to a prestigious scribal tradition, where scribal training entailed the absolute mastery of the Sumerian language. School tablets from Nippur represented the basis for our reconstruction of the Sumerian scribal education, where two clearly distinct stages have been identified: an elementary phase that provided the students with the basics of the cuneiform script, as well as Sumerian lexicon, grammar, and syntax, an advanced phase focused on the study of the Sumerian literature. At the end of the elementary stage, students were trained in the written forms of the administration and law through the compilation of model contracts and model court cases. Their learning occurred through the memorization of some standardized collection. First, students practiced the entire series of contracts step by step. Once each contract had been memorized, they would then review the series by copying it by heart. Our study of these didactic tools is useful to investigate how, in ancient Babylonia, technical and legal knowledge was transmitted through the generations. In addition, the potential of the economic and administrative data they contain can be used as an interpretative key for investigating the socio-economic dynamics of second millennium Babylonia. Thank you for your attention.